Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. Sorry for the delay, just some, obligatory technical difficulties. All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Maggie Witt. I'm the contract manager from the California Air Resources Board for the project you'll be hearing about today. I'll give a short intro and then hand it over to our researchers. But before we get started, just the typical housekeeping items. There are restrooms out these doors and to the left down the hallway a bit. In the case of an emergency and we need to evacuate the building, just go out the doors in the back of this room that you came through and downstairs out the front door that you likely came through this morning, and we'll convene over at Cesar Chavez Park. So with that out of the way, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today for this seminar. It's a really exciting project, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations from our researchers today. Before we get started, though, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about the research program that this project falls into, and this is the research at California Air Resources Board that we fund related to sustainable communities. So using the term sustainable communities likely prompts the question, what are sustainable communities? So for us, we define them as places where there is safe, reliable, and affordable transportation choices. These are choices that improve air quality, public health, and reduce greenhouse gases. They also provide equitable and affordable energy and location-efficient housing options, and improved access to quality employment, education, and other resources and services, and safe, vibrant surroundings. So the research that we support in our Sustainable Communities research program is trying to combat climate change, meet air quality standards, create healthier homes and communities, and work toward equality in environmental and health outcomes. So to try to help people who are interested in the research that we sponsor, we have categorized our sustainable communities research into these three categories: low carbon transportation choices, land use and transportation planning, and green buildings. On this slide, the first link that you see, that's the link to our research program. You can go here to learn about our completed and ongoing research projects. The second link here is to our SB 375 and Sustainable Communities program. So you can learn more about our evaluation of sustainable community strategies and our recent update to the SB 375 targets. So today we will be hearing from two researchers, Dr. Paul Ong from UCLA and Dr. Gian-Claudia Sciarra from University of Texas at Austin. They are going to be talking about this project that looked into different indicators and data that could be used to evaluate our progress toward meeting the goals of SB 375. So to understand the motivation for this project, it's useful to have a little background about this law, Senate Bill 375. Many of you are probably familiar, but it's important to remember that through this law, what was initially done was the setting of targets for regions to meet greenhouse gas reductions. Those targets were set by the California Air Resources Board, and then the regional governments, the metropolitan planning organizations, they put together sustainable community strategies to meet the targets that were set. So what the law basically says is if these sustainable community strategies are implemented, we will achieve the greenhouse gas reductions that we need to meet our AB 32 goals. So 8 years have passed since those initial targets were set, and many sustainable community strategies have been completed and reviewed by ARB. So now the time is ripe for revisiting our progress in meeting the goals of SB 375 and AB 32. So to do that, we need to look at on-the-ground changes in land use, housing, and transportation, and evaluate if they're leading to the changes that we hope to see with the implementation of this law. So in other words, we're asking the question, are emissions going down from reducing the length and number of vehicle trips that are taken, and is that trajectory in line with what we hope to achieve through our goals? So measuring this is much more complex than it may seem. This is why we needed to recruit the help of our esteemed researchers who are here today to try to help us evaluate what are the best or most appropriate indicators and data for trying to track changes across this whole state. So we acknowledge the importance of doing this. It's really important for meeting our goals, and Caltrans acknowledges this too. So they partnered up with us on this project, and actually we split it into 2 phases. So what you'll hear about today is phase 1, where we looked at the different data and metrics and indicators that are possible, and then did a pilot with the LA County using their real world data. And then phase 2, which is currently underway, that's funded by Caltrans, and in that phase, Dr. Ong and his team are scaling up what they did in the pilot to the statewide level, and they're making some adjustments to the indicators based on the lessons that they've learned in this phase. So luckily for us at Air Resources Board, this project was already underway when Senate Bill 150 was passed, and that law requires the Air Resources Board to report on our progress in meeting the goals of these climate laws. So we'll be writing up a first report for the legislature by this September, and of course the lessons that we learned through this process and the metrics that were identified will be very helpful for that. So before I turn over to the researchers, I wanted to give them a proper introduction. So we'll be hearing from Dr. Paul Ong. He's a research professor at UCLA's School of Public Affairs. He's also the director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. He's researched many different topics: labor market status of minorities and immigrants, displaced high-tech workers, work and transportation spatial mismatch, environmental justice, and gentrification. You may recognize his name, and he might look familiar when he gets up here. If you have watched any of our other research seminars, he presented last year on our displacement study with UC Berkeley and UCLA. Dr. Gian-Claudia Ciara teaches at the University of Texas at Austin in their School of Architecture, and there she is the assistant professor of community and regional planning. She researches and writes about transportation and land use policy, planning and decision making. Regional transportation institutions have been a focus of her research for many years, and so she was able to lend her expertise for this project. Before joining the University of Texas, she was a professional researcher at UC Davis's Institute of Transportation Studies. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Dr. Zong and Ciara. And I want to note that at the end of their presentation, we will have time for questions. So please keep them in mind and jot them down. Those of you who are on the webcast, you'll be able to email your questions in. There will be a email address shown on your screen that will be the destination for any of your questions. So with that, I'll turn it over. Thank you. You can use, you can use either just the arrow down, or you can use this one. Okay, thank you.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Maggie. It's wonderful to be back in Sacramento. I was born and raised here, so this is my hometown. All right, so let's get started. As Maggie mentioned, jump forward. This project is in two phases. So the first phase is developing and evaluating a prototype for Los Angeles. We're in the start of the second phase, which is scaling up what we know up to the state of California. And these are the relevant parts of SB 375. Clearly, there's a discussion about how do we think about land use and land use development that's consistent with sustainable community strategies. And it's that second one that we're focused on. So the project objectives are really to try to monitor real world changes in a shorter time period. That is, rather than waiting for, let's say, every 10 years, is there a way we can monitor exactly what's happening on the ground in terms of changes in use as it relates to different indicators of sustainability? And the first phase is to do the work for a prototype in Los Angeles, and it's mainly focused around how do we sort of look at the data, evaluate the data, look at the different metrics, how do we evaluate them, how do we interpret those things, and then what do we learn from those results in terms of scaling up to the state of California. So this is roughly the progress that we've made throughout the project. We chose 2010 as our baseline. We tried then identify characteristics for that baseline for small geographies. We then identify since 2010 what are the new developments and changes. We evaluate those in terms of indicators from the baseline, and then we try to interpret those results as whether they're not consistent with SB 375 goals or not. What we mean by short term is just encapsulated in this graph. So in planning, we quite often do long-term planning efforts. You could recognize that, for example, in our transportation planning, that is going out a decade or more. What do we expect to see? What do we expect to see if we have certain types of intervention? How does that change people's behavior in terms of travel, in terms of land use, and so forth? Our project is not that part of it. Ours is really, again, looking at real-world changes over a short time period. Our definition, at least in terms of developing the prototype and experimenting with the prototype, is either 1 or 4 years. The first step is data assembly and assessment. And for this type of project, there are a number of issues in terms of data. We're mainly concerned about consistency, geographic consistency, consistencies in definitions of variables, consistency over time, and also the accuracy and precisions of that data, whether there are known problems within the data, and if so, how do we best handle those sort of problems? Oh, you're welcome to ask questions of clarification, substantive question, if you could hold off for question and answer period, that's great. So we again took 2010 as our baseline, and the reason for that is 2010 gives us the most detailed information, particularly around housing. We get down to very small geographies in terms of understanding the patterns of land use. The disadvantage of using the census and using tracts as our baseline is that tracts, for example, are not stable over time. So if you look at the decade, for example, between 2000 and 2010 in Los Angeles, there were massive changes in geographies in terms of tracts. And they're not just simply one of splitting or consolidating tracts. The Census Bureau, with input from local stakeholders, actually moved boundaries around. And so that poses a problem. The other one is that some of our data sources don't come in tracts. And so there is an issue about how do you allocate that information into tracts. Clearly, if the information is geographically much more, in terms of resolution, finer than tracts, it's easier than trying to take information, for example, by zip codes and allocate it to tracts. So there are challenges in terms of using tracts. Our key baselines that we want to start off, that is, what is the pattern of the urban spatial structure? The key ones are housing densities, accessibility from a location to job opportunities, accessibility in terms of from one residential location to retailing activities, and accessibility to transit. For the prototype, we focused on buses and bus lines. And in terms of activity spaces, we used the decennial enumeration, as I mentioned, simple calculations such as area density, and there's different ways of calculating that, so we looked at different ways of doing it, but essentially what I'm presenting is what we ended up with. Here's an example of just looking at housing unit density in Los Angeles. And so you could see huge variations. Part of it's driven by huge open spaces, such as our national forests and so forth. But even beyond that, you find areas that are low density. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, that's Palos Verdes. And so those tend to be very large parcel single-family homes, whereas around downtown, both in Long Beach and Los Angeles, you find high-density development, high unit development. We looked at accessibility to jobs. We worked mainly with what's known as LEHD. We triangulated that with CTPP, the Census Transportation Planning Package. We also use, in terms of estimating distances between where one works and where one lives, by creating information from the HARE network in terms of times and distance in terms of traveling. Our main mode of traveling we looked at is by automobile. And accessibility is measured by a simple decay function that takes into account either the time and distance between 2 points and weighing it that the longer the distance, the less those job opportunities are. The parameter for the decay function is estimated specifically for the region, and that's based on other sorts of data that we have. We also experimented with multiple different functional forms to see which ones are best matched with observed employment patterns. Here is a map of accessibility measures. The darker the color, the higher the accessibility, the lighter the shading, the lower the job accessibility. We did a similar sort of process in terms of accessibility from place of residence to retailing activities. We use mainly the Dun & Bradstreet data in terms of establishments. We again use the network information in terms of time and distance travel. We use just a simple inverse function because people's shopping distances tends to be shorter than commute to work distances. Here's the map for Los Angeles about accessibility to retailing. Again, the darker the shade, the greater accessibility. And then we developed a baseline in terms of accessibility to bus transit. And we use GTFS as our main data source. And so there's a couple of different ways of calculating it, but essentially what we ended up are areas with high levels of service within a quarter mile of the bus stop. There is a major problem with the GTFS. If you guys have worked with it, you realize that not all public agencies report using this format. And the second thing is, as far as we could tell, doing some assessment, the way they report is not consistent across agencies. So there are challenges of using this sort of data to estimate accessibility to public transit. And nonetheless, here's a map that represents what we can look at. The darker blue are areas that have high levels of bus accessibility, and the yellow has very low accessibility. There are areas where there are what we call holes in the system in terms of data. Probably the most prominent one is actually in the north part of the county, Palmdale, Lancaster area. We actually have, from the agencies themselves, data that we have experimented with to do our own calculations of accessibility. But just in terms of the standard data sources, it's missing. Short term, so we tried looking at changes in housing units, that is new housing units coming in, looked at changes in where jobs are occurring, changes in retail activities in terms of sales. And again, we use a number of data sources, including parcel data, LHD, and Dun & Bradstreet, to measure the change, the short-term changes. So in some ways, you could think about what we did as a simple matrix, that on one axis is the baseline. They sort of characterize the current or the baseline land use activities. And across other axes are changes since that baseline. And so it's a simple matrix. And actually, you could calculate these indicators to fill in every cell. But they don't necessarily make sense in terms of interpreting it, particularly interpreting it, what it means for strategic, sustainable change, strategic SCS. I'll just leave it at that. So some are very easy to interpret and clear. So if you go down the column of new housing units, if we know where new housing units are occurring, relative to housing density, relative to job accessibility, relative to accessibility to retailing, relative to accessibility to transit, it's easy for us to interpret what those numbers mean, whether they're consistent with SB 375 or not. Some of the other cells are less unambiguous. That is, the literature actually doesn't tell us if you, for example, place more jobs in high-density housing areas, that's at lower or increased job travel. So many of those cells are not easily interpreted. And so we just label them as being unclear or ambiguous. The transit row on the bottom, whether you talk about new housing, changes in jobs, changes in retailing, is pretty easy to interpret, our understanding of what they mean. So how do you interpret the ones that we feel comfortable interpreting? It's a simple way of doing it. That is, the literature tells us you would like, for example, new housing to go into more dense areas that have greater accessibility to jobs and retailing and transit. So if you look at the new housing that's going in, you ask a simple question. Is it going in proportionally or disproportionately into denser areas, greater accessible areas? And so here is, I'm going to just run quickly through some of results. Here, if we look at new housing development in terms of either the 1 year out or 4 years out, in Los Angeles, the first column is the distribution of the baseline housing units, occupied housing units in 2010. So these tracts are created by essentially quintiles of tracts. So the lowest quintile is the 20% of tracts for the lowest housing density. The top quintile is the 20% of tracts with the greatest housing density. Clearly, because you have different number of units in each of these tracts, it's not exactly 20% when you count housing units. But what we're really interested is comparing the distribution of new housing units compared to the baseline. And so our assessment of the prototype in terms of new housing is that a disproportionately more units in Los Angeles over the year since the baseline, or 4 years out since the baseline, a disproportionate number are going into the least dense areas in Los Angeles. Our interpretation is that that is not at a simple level consistent with the goals. Of course, there's complexity, as some of my colleagues have reminded me here at the state, that those new developments in the less dense area could be very complicated because they could be mixed use and so forth. We acknowledge that. So this is just meant to raise sort of at the top level what we know about the patterns of land use. Here is in terms of job accessibility. That is, new housing units, again, by and large, at least for the 1 year, going into the areas that are least dense relative to the baseline. 4 years out, it's a little different. That is, we see a disproportionate number of units, new units, going into the two extremes. Here's in terms of retailing, and here in terms of access to transit. And actually, I think the transit story is by and large the more successful story compared to accessibility or density. One of the things is that we did not directly look at VMT as our baseline, and for a couple of reasons. One is it's really difficult to estimate for small areas. And by and large, we don't have really good data other than commute to work. All the other sort of travel patterns have to be estimated, quite often using very complex urban travel models. And even the data that we have for commute patterns are not VMT, they're PMTs. So we could track individual workers in terms of the flows between origins and destination. You still need to convert that or estimate that into VMTs. And also, this contract, it was well beyond the scope of this contract in terms of resources. Limitation of prototype. So one of the other limitations we found is that if you look at particularly very short-term changes in jobs and retailing, it gets confounded by the business cycle. That is, we know that jobs and the level of spending on retailing fluctuates as the economy expands or as the economy contracts. And our assessment is that that's quite noticeable, and it can distort the data. That is, we're looking at cyclical effect rather than longer term, or at least moderate term cyclical, secular effects. So that's a problem with the data looking at retailing and job changes. Retailing also seems to be affected in terms of the shift to e-commerce. We don't have small area information on the impact of e-commerce, but looking at the aggregate data for Los Angeles County over a 5 to 10 year period, it's very visible and very noticeable. I believe it's in the report or in one of our briefs. So those things make those two indicators of change very problematic. So, conclusion. In terms of assessing the data and so forth, in the end, we do believe that although there are limitations both in terms of data, in terms of the methodology and so forth, that at least for many of the indicators and many of the things that we're tracking, it's yielding useful information that we could look at in terms of real-time changes that's happening. No perfect data. I went over some of the problems of the data that we've used. I think it's going to be even more challenging when we go up to the state. For example, we already start looking at the parcel data, and there are challenges in terms of consistency because each parcel data is collected by the county. Each assessor seems to have his or her own sort of method about what to record and how to record. It doesn't mean that that information's not useful. It just means it's another challenge in terms of how do we address those data issues and how do we reconcile it when we move to a statewide level monitoring system. Again, this is a summary, which is about what is useful, what's not so useful in terms of the particularly the short-term changes in jobs and retailing. For the second stage, we are meeting with our stakeholders so we can have discussion with them in terms of, are there other indicators that are more useful that would be less ambiguous, but nonetheless will produce some useful information for the states, for the state agencies as well as for stakeholders. Okay, so I think this is where I end. And Gian-Claudia will talk about her component of it, which is sort of very important because we also want to do a monitoring system and figure out how we can work with Mpos in terms of developing this monitoring system. Yeah. Okay.
No, this is good because you can see what's coming next. Okay. Well, I'm picking up where Paul left off. A second component of this project really focused on understanding what metropolitan regions in California are doing already to monitor implementation of the sustainable community strategies in their service areas. And in order to discover what regions were up to in this regard, we conducted interviews of the metropolitan planning organizations throughout the state. We thought it would be useful to understand what their activities were already and what some of their challenges were. And so our basic question was, what do we know about how regions are going about this, if they're going about it at all? We really didn't have a good sense of whether or not this was something regions, metropolitan planning organizations, in other words, were actively tracking or not. Perhaps they were already trying to do something along the lines of what Paul undertook. Our hunch was probably not to that extent, but we wanted to see what they were up to. And it's asking these kinds of questions really does shed light on some of the institutional relationships that are at the core of SB 375 and its implementation. So as Maggie gave us a nice primer on what the policy is, but as many of you know, SB 375 essentially asks regional scale organizations, MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, those planning bodies that are required by federal law to undertake transportation planning in metro regions. It asks those organizations to do something somewhat new, identify a forecasted development pattern in the future that, when combined with transportation investments, is going to help reduce reliance on the automobile, reduce VMT, and get the region toward its greenhouse gas reduction targets. However, It is the cities and counties, local governments in California, in other words, that maintain authority over land use decisions. And so these are the entities that will adopt general plans, zoning ordinances, approve development proposals, issue building permits, et cetera. And they have a direct impact on whether or not the kinds of land use changes that are anticipated as beneficial from the regional planning side of things, the sustainable community strategy, actually unfold on the ground. And so we asked, do MPOs actually track land use and development changes in their respective regions? And if so, how do they do that? So we undertook interviews with the senior land use planning staff at every MPO in the state of California. There are 18 of them. In some instances, we conducted a repeat interview and spoke to that same individual twice, or may have spoken to a couple of people within the planning staff there. And so we collected quite a bit of interview data. I brought it up here with me. It's osmosing. All of the information we gleaned from the interviews are contained in that valuable folder. And we also reviewed the regional transportation plans from each of the metro regions. Particularly, we looked at the chapters that talked about development of the SCS and any technical appendices on land use. These gave us some good insights into what the MPO was actually tracking. We learned, I'd say, 6 interesting things. And one is that MPOs do collect diverse and sometimes very extensive data about land use and development changes in the region. Some of these data are things that one would look to really understand what's happening with land use and development changes. On the other hand, few MPOs really see it as their task or their responsibility or role to monitor or track or police, let me say, whether or not local government land use and development decisions are aligning with that SCS. And that was very clear in many of our interviews. Mostly, the data that MPOs collect related to land use, they are collecting to fulfill their responsibilities to develop and adopt a regional transportation plan. They are not collecting a lot of land use information to understand the kinds of baseline versus out-year comparisons that Paul just presented to you. And while many MPOs do collect these data to inform their own work, few of them really try to do this outside of the 4-year regional transportation plan development cycle. Mostly their data collection efforts are pinned to and focused on that RTP cycle. Without really doing too much, many MPOs actually receive a somewhat steady flow of information about land use and development in their regions. They may be performing a regional clearinghouse function, which some of you are familiar with under CEQA in California when there are significant projects that need to undergo environmental review. The intergovernmental review process is there to ensure that the relevant agencies comment on that development proposal. And sometimes MPOs participate in that process or even coordinate that process. And so they're cognizant and get information about significant developments happening in the region. Local governments may also as a matter of protocol, send the MPO news and notices about when they're updating their general plan, if they're making any major general plan amendments, if they are anticipating updating their zoning, et cetera. And so sometimes an MPO receives lots of valuable information that just kind of streams in. On the most part, however, many MPOs also struggle to collect and maintain consistent sources of data for asking the kinds of questions about what's happening with land use and development in their region. If you can imagine, an MPO is one regional agency, but it may have scores to over 100 local governments in its region, and in order for the MPO to collect all of that information that's generated at the local level can be quite a challenge. So what kinds of information do MPOs commonly receive or collect? It's pretty standard for an MPO to have the land use information, land use and zoning maps from its local government. Whether or not those information all come in the same format is another question. Many local governments don't have a GIS system, and so they may be transmitting to the MPO paper maps. MPOs commonly get information about general plan updates. If a local government is setting about doing that, they may get information about a proposed general plan amendment. Generally, the more significant the amendment, the more likely the MPO is to hear about it. And they may commonly hear about development proposals that do trigger this environmental review under CEQA through the intergovernmental review process. And here I will say that I think one of the more interesting things that we learned was that this intergovernmental review process really does seem to be a very valuable way that MPOs can and do, to some extent, learn about local development happenings. It may not be as rigorously exploited as it could be. At the same time, MPOs are hungry for more data, and one of the key areas which we found most MPOs we spoke to were eager for more data were in the housing domain. So MPOs want more data on housing provision. They'd like to get local updates on the housing elements when local governments do those. They would like to see the local government's reports to HCD on their housing production. They'd like to get housing permit data, building permit data, to give them a really robust sense of what's happening in their region. And as with all of the data sources, most MPOs experience a range of heavy and light information flows with their local governments. MPOs also identified many other types of information that they felt would assist them in understanding what's unfolding in their regions after the adoption of their SCS. And on the next couple of slides, I've listed these. Some of these were, many of these were kind of, I'd say, one-offs, so maybe only one or two mentioned them. But in some cases, there was, at least a cluster of MPOs that were expressing interest in these kinds of data. So information about agricultural or conservation easements, affordable housing, what are the deed-restricted properties in their region, assessors' parcel data, that was kind of a big want. Information from cities about the bicycle network or bicycling data or bicycling counts, certificates of occupancy. Many MPOs said that would be helpful to help them understand what was going on with building and construction. County general plans with digital maps and updates when they get updated. employment data, commercial and non-residential vacancy rates to understand what's happening with non-residential properties, business permits, data on house prices, particularly in regions that are experiencing real challenges with housing affordability, data on impact fee, what local governments are collecting and assessing in that regard. Parking inventories, pedestrian counts, more real-time traffic data, rental price data, and transit passenger counts. Some of the data sources they listed are obviously things that feed more into the transportation planning side of the MPO, but many of these really are pieces of information they feel are important for understanding what's happening with land use and development. So what we found essentially is that the tracking practices that we find being used by metropolitan planning organizations vary somewhat widely. And we tried, there are 18 MPOs in California, and we tried to characterize the range of practices in a way that would help us understand both how frequently MPOs sought to collect important data to help them understand land use and development changes, and also the extent to which they sort of gathered those data and scrutinized those data. And so in putting MPOs in buckets in these two different dimensions, we generally found that the largest and most urban MPOs or MPOs with special authority, for instance, the Lake Tahoe Regional Planning Authority, which has unusual responsibilities and authorities in land use because of its proximity to Lake Tahoe, that these were the agencies that tended to most frequently collect data and to more rigorously examine and monitor land use changes in their region. On the opposite end of the spectrum were smaller, more rural metropolitan planning organizations, often organizations with small staffs, limited amounts of resources, also serving local governments that may not individually at the jurisdictional level have the capacity to collect these data and pass them on to the MPO. And they tended to really focus their data collection and analysis efforts around the RTP pretty exclusively. And somewhere in the middle, we found metropolitan planning organizations that had resources and interest in tracking what was going on. But sometimes we heard that the level and the pace of development was such that there really wasn't a lot of change to track. So we completed our interviews in winter and early spring of 2017, and many local governments at that time were still really in a place where they were not seeing a lot of development activity post the recession. It was just beginning to pick back up, perhaps. So we found that there were certainly some commonalities in what seemed to impact whether or not an MPO was more active and energetic about tracking land use and development changes in their region. Certainly the rate of growth seemed to be a factor. Again, where things were not moving very quickly with development, there was less of an impetus and a sort of catalyst for keeping track of what was happening. Where an MPO was serving a region with very environmentally sensitive areas or habitats, or had particular environmental issues, that seemed to be a motivator for paying closer attention, collecting more data, scrutinizing it more. Where an MPO served a region with lots of local governments, the presence of all those local governments just made the data collection and monitoring task harder. And so more local governments makes it more difficult. On the local side, when local governments do general plan updates, that seems to increase the, MPOs paying attention. Also, local governments' own staffing and resources have an impact where local governments can maintain accurate, current, robust data repositories about land use, about zoning, about building permits, about general plan amendments. These kinds of things make it easier for the MPO, and there's more capacity to share data. Where local projects are being submitted to local governments as part of this clearinghouse or environmental intergovernmental review process under CEQA, that seems to increase the ability of MPOs to track what's happening. On the MPO side, certainly an MPO's own staffing and resource levels influences its ability to collect data from its local governments and, put together a compelling narrative of what's happening. Whether or not the MPO is really a standalone metropolitan planning organization, or whether it's an MPO that's housed in a COG, or perhaps also serves as the Airport Land Use Planning Commission, or whether it performs the intergovernmental review function for that region. Where an MPO has many overlapping functions, there tends to be more capacity for data collection and data monitoring. It makes sense. Where there is good MPO local government communication, that tends to increase data sharing, and where the MPO is involved in that clearinghouse review again. In terms of the data themselves, where data are standardized across local governments, that makes it easier. And where data is privately owned or proprietary, that makes it more difficult. I mentioned the parcel, assessor's parcel data. That was something that many local governments named as something they would like to have, and that can be challenging. Where data are published frequently, that makes it easier generally, although it can also make things more difficult in terms of being able to keep on top of it. And obviously the quality of data can make it easier for an MPO to more rigorously collect that and analyze it. So a few notable practices, I think, that we observed. Again, the intergovernmental review and clearinghouse process. I can't really underscore how frequently this came up, but most MPOs kind of saw it as, well, this is something that's a function that happens here because of CEQA, but it really did seem to be a process and a practice that's in place that brings valuable information to the MPO. Many MPOs do their own internal tracking of development in the region. They may keep track of, through an own internal, sort of informally crafted database. They may keep track of development proposals in the region or zoning changes. Many MPOs have, well, I would say all really sort of described having meetings as soon as they were getting ready to update the RTP SCS. That's something that's required. But these meetings tend to be a platform for opening the channels of communication between the MPO and the local governments they serve about sharing important data. MPOs that have overlapping roles, as I described earlier. That makes it a lot easier for data to come to the MPO or for the MPO to seek it out. And notably, some MPOs have developed their own development proposal or project trackers for significant development in their region, or some kind of regional indicator dashboard. So for those of you who are familiar with the vital signs website of the MTC, serving the San Francisco Bay Area, that's perhaps one of the premier examples of these indicator websites where the MPO is taking the data that it has on many of the domains that Paul described: housing, development activity, business, retail, et cetera, and making those publicly available and presenting those in a spatial context. Some of the challenges. So data integration is a key one. MPOs serving regions with lots of local governments have to compile zoning information that's tracked and maintained by many local governments in different formats. And the MPO has to bring that all together and kind of combine it into a common format so it can make sense and be analyzed. Going below the level of the MPO, local governments often don't have the capacity to do a very robust job of tracking what's happening with development in their borders and develop data sources that can be shared, that are beyond paper, or that are usable, robust GIS systems. Also, we found that that problem is obviously exacerbated where there's lots of local governments, right? You have the challenge of doing it at one local government and then having to do it across multiple. We found that monitoring where it is done either by local governments or the MPO is really seldom assessing land use developments with reference to SCS goals. And I think this comes back to one of the points I made at the beginning of the presentation, is that although MPOs collect a lot of land use and development data, very few see it as their role to monitor or assess or do a report card on whether or not local governments are really making development choices that reflect their SCS. So some concluding observations. I think that really any statewide picture of SB 375 progress that we might construct from data that is collected by MPOs as we see that now would inevitably be incomplete. It would probably have a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of gaps. We see different practices across all 18 MPOs, and within one MPO, an MPO has inconsistent sources of data from the local governments it's serving. So it really makes sense that to have some meaningful barometer of SB 375 progress across the state, that we need some kind of a unified statewide data system. And finally, doing monitoring at a scale above the MPO or facilitating monitoring at a level above the MPO, I think may be politically very attractive to some of the organizations that we spoke to. Many of the MPOs reported having to do significant education at the start of their first RTP/SCS process. They had to do a lot of trust building with local governments, that they were not coming in as the Metropolitan Planning Organization and wanting to dictate what kinds of development and land use policies local governments approved. There was a lot of skepticism to overcome between regions and local governments. and regions, the metropolitan planning organizations, I think we're very sensitive to the fact that local governments really wanted to assert and be clear about their ability to be the authoritative land use decision maker. And so asking MPOs to conduct monitoring or create report cards on local governments, I think, particularly in some places, could be a challenging political dynamic that maybe is better placed elsewhere. So with that, our research team would really like to extend our thanks to some key individuals and organizations for supporting this project. First and foremost, the California Air Resources Board for funding and program support, particularly Maggie Witt and Annalisa Schilla. And we also really benefited from a very active and thoughtful advisory committee. Some of you are here in the room, Chris, and some others maybe that I'm not recalling. And we really want to thank you that made this project really, I think, very well informed and really gave us some opportunities at key points of the research development to check in with you all and get valuable feedback.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation. So we have about a half an hour, 25 minutes for questions. So if you are watching the webcast, hopefully there is an email address on your screen, but just in case, I'll read it aloud. It is coastalrm@calepa.ca.gov. And if anybody in the room is interested in asking a question or making a comment, just raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone so that everyone on the webcast will be able to hear. So go ahead and raise your hands. If you don't have a question, we do have a question from the web. I can kick us off. I will go ahead and do that. Okay. So we had a question came in a bit earlier for Paul, actually, on the use of bus transit as an access to transit metric. There's a question about if you excluded light rail and in the scale up, if that means that subways like BART won't be included. And I think it would be helpful just to have you both answer that question and maybe explain a little bit about using bus transit and not light rail transit, and if you're planning to look at other types of transit in the scale up. Thanks.
Our choices is really about trying to figure out where some of the data challenges are, as well as where we can make some progress. So we're very open to looking at rail transit and also to incorporate that into either as a component of or an additional layer in terms of transit access. It's still our opinion that the bus system is the most challenging in terms of getting consistent data across different regions. And for many people, the bus system is also the most important system. So it was more of a matter of choice about where we put our resources than anything else. Again, for the second phase, it is part of the discussion about how do we handle rail transit. And again, we will get input from our stakeholders. So my apologies of not saying, yes, I'm going to do this, or no, I'm not going to do this. We do want to really hear from our stakeholders, but also pose a challenge. There's a limited amount of resources that's available. We just want to prioritize the type of work we do that best serves the state and the state agencies.
All right, I'm going to take a question from here in the room. Ella raised her hand first. Sorry, Mani.
No, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for your research. I have a question for Dr. Ong, kind of two-part question, and that is, what are your reflections or ideas for phase 2 on further relating these indicators to the actual SCSs and to the Mpos actions? So as I understand, these indicators reveal the trend on the ground compared to the trend expected from 375 implementation, but they don't really compare what did the SCS call for and how is that being met. So like using the SCS as a benchmark. And then similarly, from a policy perspective, or like how to use this, I'm concerned that the indicators, as acknowledged, aren't directly related to what the MPOs are actually responsible for. They can do some things like provide incentives, but they are not the local jurisdiction. So any thoughts about indicators of MPOs' actions and how they relate to change on the ground?
So in terms of our thinking based on our assessment of what was done for Los Angeles, in phase 2, we have recommended replacing looking at changes in retailings and jobs with a analysis of what people are concerned about in terms of jobs housing fit. And there it is more about the segment of the population that's struggling in terms of affordable housing. And so the jobs housing balance fit, one definition of it, it's not the only definition, is that are there areas where there are abundant number of low wage, low skill, or low income jobs, but not sufficient housing for the workers there. And therefore, there's a consequence in terms of travel and so forth. So that's where we're roughly headed. I will find out more this afternoon when I meet with our advisory committee. And again, we want to make sure we make decisions that prioritize the ones that gives the most bang for the dollar. And it's not to say that we shouldn't monitor these other aspects. I do think if you look at the patterns of travel, what we know about travel in terms of VMT by different activities, certainly employment is up there, retailing is up there. Travel for school purposes, whether yourself or your children, is sort of in the sort of top set of ranking. And so part of it is driven by what we know about travel. Getting to your second question, if I understand it correctly, is how do we use this relative to assessing SES and some of its goals and objectives? So clearly what we're relying on are indicators or proxies that we know from the literature and our own research that are related to particularly VMT. And the assumption is that therefore it's related to greenhouse gases. So we don't do that directly at this point, although one of the things that we did recommend for this afternoon is, at least in terms of job centers, looking at job centers in terms of the PMT and estimated VMTs that are generated. So if we know jobs are going into those job centers, you would prefer from an environmental point of view, jobs going into areas that tend to attract labor that's nearby, and therefore less PMT, less VMT. And we actually could observe the PMT directly from some of our data. So that's going to get us a little bit closer directly to VMT, PMT. In terms of how to use this information in terms of assessing progress that's been made or challenges, this was never meant as a system to take the information and evaluate it against a set of plans that were proposed. It was to generate additional insights in terms of what's actually happening. our hope is that that information will be useful for agencies and other stakeholders who are interested in taking that information and assessing it. I would say that even with, okay, so there are two issues. One is that at the programmatic policy level, how do you link this sort of data to any particular policy and program? That's critical, but that's going to take a lot of work. How do you take this type of information and other types of information to make that direct link? But at another level, regardless of the policies and programs, if you see that there are areas in California that essentially is going off in the wrong direction. So if you look at, for example, in Los Angeles, at least our data show, in terms of putting housing into dense areas, it's not going in that direction. You can't say, is it because of failure of SCS policies and programs, or is it just the market overwhelming things? You can't answer that with this data, although it points you in the right direction about where you should be concerned about. It doesn't, maybe in the future some additional research can bring that down to a fine grain. So you could use this information, and this information by itself is not going to help you. It has to be in conjunction with other types of information. For example, in terms of placement of jobs, even though we're now trying to move to looking at job centers, major job centers, in terms of the average PMT and estimate VMT it generates for each job. Therefore, if you put a job in that area, what's the likely consequences? You would prefer to put ones in job centers that tends to generate lower average PMT, VMT. You could say that. And that's desirable in terms of SB 375. But markets don't work that way. Job centers are created because essentially what we call agglomeration processes, that there are economic and financial gains in terms of location of jobs, locations of businesses in a certain area. And then that's an additional layer of trade-off. How do we think about the trade-off in terms of the environmental impact versus how the market is being driven in terms of decisions by businesses where to locate? Are important questions. In future, hopefully this data will help move us in that direction. It's not an answer, but.
I'm just going to add quickly one insight from the interview work that we did and the review of the RTP SESs, and that is there are many regions in the state where there is so much development capacity represented in the SES, in that forecasted development pattern, that one could see land use choices and development choices that are going in places that are consistent with the SES RTP, but that are not necessarily the best choices from a VMT reduction perspective. And so the choice to measure alignment with the SES may also not be that meaningful in certain contexts. It depends. I think you have to look at how the MPO has crafted and mapped that forecasted development pattern, how explicit they've been about what areas are really priority for development versus different types of places where development could go, and that varies across the state.
Lisa, this is Nicole Dolney with the Air Resources Board. I wanted to respond to that as well because at our last board hearing for the SB 375 targets, we spent a lot of time talking about where we're going for the SCS evaluations and then SB 150, and it's getting at exactly what was just talked about in your question, is relating these indicators back to what's in the plans, and not just in the plans at a regional level, but where you were talking about where those investments are planned, how much was anticipated to be spent, how much has been spent, where those developments were anticipated to go and where they're actually going. And so we hope to be doing a lot more of that starting in September and then in ongoing fashion after that. All right, I'm going to alternate between webcast questions and audience questions, so I'll come back to you, Nazamani. So we had a question came in on, this question asks, it states, some MPOs have activity-based travel demand models that have information on activities other than commutes. What would you recommend for other indicators like VMT related to be looked at? I'm assuming they're saying, maybe via these other models.
Yeah, so think about two sources of data in terms of travel. In terms of what we want to do, that is by small geographies, by neighborhoods, understand what's happening. We have data sources that allows us with a degree of precision and accuracy down to the small areas to look at travel patterns. And as I mentioned, the best available data that has wide coverage detail is around job commutes. We get that both from LHD and CTPP. In terms of the other travel patterns, we have more piecemeal, ad hoc, quite often small samples, quite often biased samples. And so you could, for example, try to estimate travel patterns for shopping by using information from the California Household Transportation Survey. That is, look at, by taking the microdata, using it as a sample, saying that if a neighborhood has a certain accessibility to retailing that we can estimate, how does that impact travel for retailing? And so many of the transportation planning models essentially try to fill in the parameters in the data using the most comprehensive data possible. But you can't always do that for other patterns. So what you do is you impute that, you estimate that. You estimate it by different ways. You can estimate it by the characteristics of where these trips are generated and where they're attracted. And then therefore you model it and you come up with estimates that way. And you can do this by different activities and so forth. Your precision of doing that and your accuracy of doing that really depends on the data that you have to try to do that. So that's the second type of information we have by travel patterns. And other than job commutes, all the other travel patterns really come out of that second method. So you could actually try to take those estimates from the various transportation planning packages and programs that MPOs use. So here's the problem. So essentially, this model depends on three major components. One is a land use model. The other one is the transportation travel component. And the final one is the economic activity model. And so a good example of land use is urban sims. Transportation, the modern versions of UTIPs. In terms of economics, particularly spatialized, it's REMI. So that's a popular one. The problem, it's twofold. One is that if you do a matrix by MPOs of these three different models, what you can see is huge inconsistency. So essentially, you have inconsistency models, but that also means inconsistencies of the data they collect. Each of these models require different types of data. And therefore, that explains part of the type of diversity, heterogeneity we see in terms of data that's collected. The second thing is that the models themselves, even if it's the same model, the resolutions and the detail of the complexity that you model varies. So you could even have two agencies using the same model. But for various reasons, resource, data constraints, staff constraints, quite often they streamline the models. And so you have different sort of details in terms of variables you do. You have different details in terms of how many time iterations you do. So if you forecast in the future, you essentially iterate over time. Those are very complex processes to do. So yes, we can get some estimates of other travel patterns from MPOs. The challenge for the state is that now you can end up with very heterogeneous, incompatible, inconsistent estimates. So how do you compare what's happening in the agricultural area versus what's happening in San Diego? How much observed differences is driven by reality? How much is driven by choices in terms of data, models, and outputs? That's hard to reconcile. I do know the state also runs its own model. We've talked a little bit with this Caltrans in terms of their model. And certainly that might be one, assuming that they just do one huge model for the state of California in a consistent fashion.
Hi, thanks for your wonderful presentation. This is, again, a little bit of a data-related question. You may have answered a little bit already. So in your slide, you showed us like most of those indicators are either unclear or it's not, you can't make a clear conclusion from that. The question really to you is like, what is it because of the geographic resolution? Because especially in the land use side, you looked more at the parcel level. Maybe if you aggregate to the next level or higher resolution, can you make a little more better conclusion, or can we take that little more concrete directionality of it itself? Or what would we recommend? What is the best data set? What is the right resolution of data collection itself we should conduct here?
Yeah, can you do better? Of course, you can always do better. As being an economist, the question is, what's your marginal return for the resources you can pump in to do that? My sense is that there's probably lots of opportunity to do better at a reasonable level of resource. So you could do that. But let me give you an example of one of the uncertainties that we struggle with. And so the question, take for example, if you look at new jobs being developed, is it better to develop it in high-density housing area? Is it better to develop in high-density employment center? And so just take the latter. The literature is split on that. Okay, so there's one part of the literature that says that it's better to put jobs in terms of lowering VMT in the highest density areas rather than scattering it. Okay, and another one that says, well, that necessarily is not the right answer. But if you go back and carefully analyze the literature, these two literatures are talking about two different types of urban configuration. The one that argues for putting it in a certain place actually developed around a monocentric urban structure. Whereas the ones that find more complexity acknowledge that many metropolitan areas are polycentric or even more complex. And as soon as you get into that complexity of the real world, it becomes much more difficult to figure out, where are what do you want to put jobs that make things desirable? And so the question is, it's not that you can't conceptually think about modeling these things, but, is it worth the resources to do it? And again, where do you get the most effectiveness in terms of your investment? And that's partly driven by what ARB Caltrans really interested in. What do you sort of prioritize and what do you want to look at? Do you want to go back, for example, in the future to look at retailing and shopping at a different way than the way we looked at it? The question, part of the answer is that, how important is that travel? And we do know from at least some of the surveys that's probably the second most important mode travel in terms of activities. So yes, but you got to do analysis. Is it worth it?
Are there any questions out there in the audience? Otherwise, I can go to one here on the web. Okay, I'll read one here off the webcast. So we have a question. Did you connect superior data collection at an MPO to potentially improved local government decision-making that is consistent with the RTP SCS? So this is maybe a question for Gian-Claudia.
So I believe the question is asking whether or not we observed an MPO that did a great job with data collection, and if we were able to observe if that had some impact on local government decision making. So the answer there is That's not something that we looked into with this project. So we were speaking with the MPOs about their data collection practices and not about how local governments potentially got to see that data or whether they used it, and if they did use it, if it helped them make better land use and development choices. I have been involved in a second project related to SB 375 implementation, very complementary to this. In fact, we shared many of the same advisory board members that surveyed local governments about SB 375 implementation, and that project was conducted through the UC Davis National Center for Sustainable Transportation. What we found there is that local governments tend to have a variety of experiences in terms of how clear they think the MPO's forecasted development pattern is, how well it's been communicated to them, and also they have a variety of experiences in terms of how much they feel they participated in the development of that. And broad brush speaking, I think the more that local governments have been involved in that, this is not really sort of speaking to the question about the MPO's data collection, but it is getting to, I think, some of the relationships and the communication between the regional level and the local level. The more robust that communication is and the more rich the participation is by local governments in the SCS development, I think there are greater chances for the local governments to be making informed choices when it comes to development approvals and the like. But that would be that would be empirically a very difficult thing to ferret out or show. Even if you could collect all the data, actually being able to say, well, it's the local government's access to these data that has made them approve, these favorable SCS favorable developments, going out on a limb there, no matter how good your data is.
I fully agree with that. In our experience, both from this project as well as two other projects, one around potential gentrification around transit station, as well as a project funded by a private foundation. Essentially, I think the overall variable is what is the agenda of the local government or the agency. And so the ones who have already a strong agenda where it doesn't matter what you tell them, they have their agenda already. But the ones that maybe have an agenda that coincides with some of the goals we're talking about, even then, I think our experience is that there's a division, that some of the people we work with is much more of the politics of it. And so we would go and talk to them. They would come and we would talk with them, or we go there and talk with them for half an hour and so forth. Essentially, the question is, what do you have that would help me? But I would say there's another half that, particularly if they have strong staff who are technical in it, they do look at the data a little bit more carefully and so reflect on their agenda what the information may not tell you. But as much as I deal with data modeling, I realize our position in the world is not that we are high up there, we're somewhere down here.
Go ahead.
I guess maybe one observation to add is that if we think about SB 375 as a kind of policy, it is not in the grand scheme of things, it is not a coercive policy. It is not a highly prescriptive policy. Policies that are more coercive, that rely on very defined outcomes and prescribed steps for obtaining those outcomes are far more easy to measure in terms of compliance and to say, is the local government abiding by the SCS? Is the local government using the data of the MPO to make good decisions? But it is not that kind of policy. It was never intended to be that kind of policy. And so measuring how well everybody is abiding by it can, presents its challenges.
Okay, well, we are just a couple minutes past the end of our seminar. We did pretty good on timing. We did get more questions than we were able to cover in the presentation. So for those of you who submitted questions to the webcast, I'm going to forward them on to the researchers, and you guys can maybe get in contact if you have the time and ability to answer some further questions. I want to thank everybody for coming today and everybody who's participating on the webcast. If you have other questions come up after this seminar, here's my contact information. I can put you in touch with the researchers or help answer any questions you have about this project, how it fits in the context of ARB's research and also our Sustainable Community Program. And again, up on the slide you're seeing right now is the website for our research page, as well as our Sustainable Communities Program page. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.